The full moon cast a cold light over Ragnar's contorted face as he thrashed on the damp straw, muffling his screams beneath a clenched fist. Sweat dripped down his trembling body despite the biting chill. It was not the first night of terror since the ritual, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Shadows on the cabin walls seemed to come alive, morphing into the faces of the men he had sacrificed in trance during the last great battle. Men from his own clan. Thank you for joining this story. This channel is just beginning its journey, and every subscription means the world. It helps keep this project alive and growing toward our first 1,000 followers. If you're intrigued by tales of Vikings, human struggles, and deep, emotional journeys, please consider subscribing. And if you do, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support truly shapes this adventure ahead. The gray morning light seeped through the cracks in the wooden planks of Ragnar's cabin, casting long, fragile beams over the rough-hewn interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp earth and smoldering firewood, a mixture of smoke and cold that clung stubbornly to the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the ancient pines surrounding the settlement of Ravnholm, their brittle needles rustling like dry bones. The forest seemed endless, a dark green fortress enclosing the small cluster of cabins huddled by the shore of the fjord. Ragnar lay on a bed of straw, his body still taut with the remnants of the night's torment. The cold seeped into his bones, but the chill did little to calm the fire burning deep within his mind. His eyes, sharp and pale as the northern sky, scanned the dim interior as if searching for a place to anchor his restless spirit. The scars on his hands itched faintly, a reminder that the ritual had marked him in ways beyond flesh, forever altered, bound to a fury he could neither fully summon nor entirely suppress. At 32 winters, Ragnar was a man carved by hardship and battle. His broad shoulders bore the weight of countless conflicts, and the lines etched across his face told stories of loss and survival. His thick red beard, tangled and unkempt from weeks without proper care, framed a face both fierce and haunted. The jagged scar cutting from his bottom lip to his chin was a permanent testament to the day everything changed, the day the blood oath was sworn. As he sat up, the rough wool of his tunic scraped against his skin, and the familiar weight of his axe hung at his side, its leather strap worn but steadfast. Outside, the village slowly stirred. The muted murmur of voices, the creak of wooden wheels carrying supplies, and the distant clatter of hammers shaping metal echoed through the cold morning air. Life at Ravnholm moved forward, stubborn and relentless, even as shadows gathered in the minds of its people. Ragnar rose, his bare feet pressing against the cold wooden floor, and moved toward the small fire pit, where embers still glowed faintly. He reached for a chunk of dried meat, the texture rough and dry against his tongue, and chewed slowly. Each bite was a bitter reminder of the scarcity that marked their existence. The long winter would soon take hold, and the stores were already thin. The settlement itself was a patchwork of weathered cabins, arranged haphazardly around a muddy common space. Smoke curled from low chimneys, mingling with the morning mist that clung to the ground. Animal skins hung from poles to dry, while children's laughter, rare and fleeting, echoed from a nearby clearing where a handful of youngsters practiced with wooden swords under the watchful eye of Thorstein, the Jarl's advisor. Ragnar's gaze drifted to the edge of the village, where the dense forest loomed like a silent sentinel. The trees were gnarled and ancient, their bark scarred by time and battle. He had spent countless hours there, setting traps and scouting for game, trying to provide for the people who now looked at him with wary eyes. The memory of those eyes, mothers pulling children inside, men averting their gaze, cut deeper than any wound. His steps led him outside, the air biting against his exposed skin. He wrapped his bare fur cloak tighter around his shoulders as he made his way toward the tree line. The cold bit into his fingers, and the scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs, mingling with the faint metallic taste that lingered from days of bloodshed. Every step was deliberate, heavy with the weight of memories. The forest was both sanctuary and prison. It held the silence he craved, yet whispered with ghosts of the men whose blood cried out in the soil. His eyes scanned the underbrush, noting the broken branches and disturbed leaves, signs of movement, signs of life. The traps he had set earlier were crude but effective, meant to catch hares and small game to stretch their dwindling food supplies. In the distance, the faint sound of a horn shattered the quiet, a reminder that the village was never truly safe. Threats lingered beyond the horizon, rival clans, hungry wolves, and the ever-present specter of Ivar, the Cruel. Ragnar's jaw tightened. The name tasted like ash, a bitter poison that churned in his gut. He crouched beside one of the snares, inspecting the mechanism with practiced eyes. The trap held two small, trembling hares, their fur matted and eyes wide with fear. Ragnar's hands moved swiftly, breaking the neck of one before releasing the other back into the wild. The weight of the dead animal was a somber comfort, a reminder that life was a fragile thread. As he prepared to return to the village, a sudden rustling caught his attention. His muscles tensed, instincts honed by countless battles flaring to life. From behind a thicket stepped a figure, gaunt and weary, cloaked in tattered furs stained by mud and travel. The man's hood fell back, revealing a pale face etched with exhaustion and fear, a young boy no older than 16. Ragnar's grip tightened around the haft of his axe, eyes narrowing as the stranger stumbled forward, clutching a crude wooden staff for support. "I seek shelter," the boy whispered, voice cracked from disuse. "I have nowhere else to go." Ragnar hesitated, the weight of suspicion pressing down on him. The village was not kind to outsiders, especially those bearing the scent of enemies. Yet, something in the boy's green eyes, a flicker of desperation mingled with defiance, stirred a buried sense of duty. "Come," Ragnar said finally, turning toward the settlement. "But stay close. The woods hold more than trees." The journey back was silent, save for the crunch of snow and dead leaves beneath their feet. The boy's breath came in shallow gasps, his gaze darting nervously at every shadow. Inside the village, the reactions were immediate and harsh. Mothers pulled children behind walls, men lowered weapons and whispered of spies and traitors. But Ragnar stood firm, the axe at his side a silent warning. The boy introduced himself as Leif Erikson, his story spilling out in fragments between gasps. His home in Stavanger had been razed in a brutal raid led by none other than Ivar, the Cruel, the man who had orchestrated the blood ritual that turned Ragnar into what he was now. Leif was the sole survivor, bearing wounds that marked him as both hunted and haunted. Ragnar's mind raced, memories clashing with reality. The boy was a living reminder of the horrors he had endured, a symbol of broken bloodlines and shattered trust. Yet, beneath the rage and suspicion, a fragile thread of compassion stirred. This boy, this stranger, was now his charge. That evening, as the village settled under a blanket of stars, Ragnar sat by his fire, the flickering flames casting shadows that danced like wraiths across the walls. The weight of his past pressed down, but for the first time in weeks, the fury that consumed him faltered, replaced by a gnawing resolve. Helga, the village's ancient healer and keeper of secrets, approached quietly, her presence like a whisper in the night. Her eyes, pale and clouded, seemed to pierce the darkness that clung to Ragnar's soul. She spoke softly, her words carrying the weight of ancient wisdom and quiet power. "You carry the Berserker's burden," she said, "but you are more than the rage that seeks to consume you." Ragnar nodded, the lines of pain etched deep into his face. "I survived the sacrifice, but I am not whole. The nights are endless, haunted by those I could not save." Helga reached into her satchel, producing a small bowl of dark liquid, fragrant with bitter herbs, and whispered in the forest breathed around Ragnar in a cold, steady rhythm, the wind sighing through brittle pine needles, the distant call of a lone raven, the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots. Each step he took toward the village was weighed down by the burden he bore, an invisible weight pressing on his shoulders as heavily as the bare fur cloak clinging to his back. The bitter wind cut through the gaps in his tunic and chilled his skin, but the fire raging inside his chest was a fiercer torment. It was not hunger or cold that gripped him now. It was the darkness he carried within, a tempest born from blood and rage, from the cursed night when he had become more beast than man. The boy's sudden appearance in the forest had unnerved him, a creature out of place, fragile and broken among the shadows. Ragnar had been a man who trusted the harsh lessons of survival over the soft whispers of mercy. For years, he had walked the thin line between loyalty and destruction, his hands stained with the blood of kin and foe alike. To take in a stranger was a risk, one he was not certain the village could bear. Yet, something in the youth's eyes spoke to a deeper truth beyond wary suspicion. There was a desperate flicker there, a spark of life clinging stubbornly to hope amid ruin. It was a look that Ragnar recognized all too well, the haunted gaze of one who had seen too much, lost too much, but still refused to surrender. "Who are you?" Ragnar's voice cut through the cold air, low and steady, carrying the authority forged in countless battles. The boy flinched, clutching his tattered cloak tighter. His lips trembled, voice barely more than a whisper. Leif Erikson. My home was destroyed. I seek refuge." Ragnar's eyes narrowed, searching for deceit beneath the tremor of fear. A flicker of warning sparked at the back of his mind, the memory of Ivar the Cruel and his ruthless raids. The name was etched in the scars that mapped his skin and in the lines carved deep into his soul. If the boy was telling the truth, then he carried the shadow of that same darkness, a shadow that had swallowed entire villages without mercy. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the two men faced each other, the silence stretching taut like a drawn bowstring. Ragnar's hand rested on the haft of his axe, fingers tensing as his mind waged war between caution and compassion. To turn the boy away could mean death for the youth. To accept him might bring ruin to the village. A distant howl shattered the stillness, a reminder that the world beyond their fragile peace was brutal and unforgiving. Ragnar's heart beat faster, the old fury stirring beneath the surface. He had fought too many battles not to feel the pull of destiny in this moment, the weight of a choice that would bind their fates together. "Come," he said at last, voice gruff but resolute. "But stay close. The woods are no place for the weak." Leif's relief was palpable, his shoulders sagged, and a faint smile flickered across his pale face. He struggled to keep pace as Ragnar led him through the tangled underbrush toward the dim warmth of Ravnholm. Every crackle beneath their feet echoed like a warning, a herald of the danger that lurked in the shadows. As they walked, Ragnar's thoughts churned. This boy, so young and vulnerable, yet bearing the weight of loss and fear, stirred something long buried in him, a glimmer of protectiveness, of purpose beyond the endless cycle of rage that consumed his nights. He recalled the faces of the men he had slain in trance, the blood spilled in moments he could no longer control. Perhaps here was a chance, fragile and unforgiving, to break from the past. Arriving at the edge of the village, the flickering light of torches and fires painted the worn faces of its inhabitants in hues of orange and shadow. Mothers pulled children behind rough wooden walls, men tightened grips on weapons, and whispers of suspicion and fear swept through the crowd like a cold wind. Ragnar's arrival with the stranger drew a heavy silence, punctuated only by the wary eyes that followed their every move. Thorstein, the Jarl's advisor, stepped forward from the gathered crowd, his dark eyes narrowing as he assessed the newcomer. The man's presence was a reminder of the unrest that simmered beneath the village's fragile calm. a reminder that trust was a currency harder earned than gold. Who is this? Thorstein's voice was sharp, edged with distrust. A spy? A follower of Ivar's cruel brotherhood. Ragnar met his gaze without flinching. He is under my protection. Until I know otherwise, he is not your enemy. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding cautiously, others frowning with skepticism. The villagers had seen the madness that had overtaken Ragnar since the ritual, the Berserker fury that had turned friend against friend, brother against brother. To place their trust in him now was a gamble few were willing to take. Helga emerged silently from the shadows, her pale eyes fixed on Leif with a mixture of sympathy and knowing. The old healer's presence was a balm to some, a shroud of mystery to others. She carried the weight of the village's secrets and the wisdom of many winters, and her quiet authority softened some suspicions. Ragnar led the boy through the narrow paths between cabins until they reached his own dwelling, a modest shelter at the village's edge, where the forest pressed close and the wind whispered like a ghost. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a faint comfort against the chill seeping through the wooden walls. Leif sagged against the rough bench, exhaustion painting his features with shadows. Ragnar offered him dried meat and water, watching as the boy ate with a hunger born of desperation. The flickering flames cast dancing light over their faces, one marked by battle and torment, the other by loss and fragile hope. "Why did you defend me?" Leif asked quietly, voice still fragile, but carrying a growing strength beneath it. Ragnar hesitated, the weight of his own past pressing down on him. "Because I know what it means to be hunted, to bear a burden heavier than the armor we wear. Because I have no peace, and perhaps, in protecting you, I might find a sliver of it." Leif's eyes searched his face, the flicker of suspicion mingling with something resembling trust. "Ivar," the name tasted like ash on his tongue. "He destroyed my home, killed those I loved. Why do you carry his curse? Why do you not hate him?" Ragnar's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the haft of his axe. The memory of that night, the blood, the screams, the ritual that had forged him into a berserker, was a wound that never healed. "Because I was forced to walk the path he laid. Because I survived when others did not. Because hatred is a fire that can burn us all if we let it." Leif nodded slowly, the shadow of grief flickering in his eyes. "I do not know who I am without him, without the blood he spilled." "You are not his shadow," Ragnar said firmly. "You are your own man, and I will see to it that you have the chance to choose your own path." The night deepened, settling like a shroud over the village. Outside, the wind whispered among the trees, carrying with it the scent of smoke and distant dangers. Ragnar sat in silence, the weight of his vigil pressing down like stone. A sudden, sharp knock at the door shattered the fragile calm. Ragnar's hand went to his axe, muscles coiling as he rose. Through the shadows beyond the threshold, Thorstein's grim face appeared, lit by the flicker of the torch he carried. "Ragnar," he said, voice low but urgent. "The village speaks in hushed tones. They question your loyalty. The boy's origins stir fear, and the threat of Ivar's return looms." Ragnar met his gaze, unwavering. "Let them talk. I have chosen my course." Thorstein's eyes hardened. "Be wary. Some among us will not wait for your judgment." As Thorstein disappeared into the night, Ragnar's mind churned with the inevitability of the storm gathering on the horizon. The boy was a spark in the dark, fragile, unpredictable, but vital. To protect him was to invite conflict, but to abandon him was to surrender to the shadows of the past. In the stillness, Ragnar knelt beside the fire, the amber glow reflecting in his haunted eyes. The poison of the berserker rage pulsed just beneath the surface, a beast clawing against its cage. Yet now, for the first time since the ritual, he felt a flicker of control, a fragile thread of clarity woven by Helga's mysterious potion. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, both within and beyond the walls of Ravnholm. But tonight, beneath the cold gaze of the stars, Ragnar stood nearby, his broad figure casting a long shadow over the room. He watched Leif with a mixture of wariness and something softer, a guarded concern that had been buried deep beneath years of battle and loss. His scarred hands moved to the edge of the bench, fingers tapping quietly, betraying the tight grip he held on his own restraint. Slowly, Ragnar reached into a small sack hanging from a peg near the door, pulling out a chunk of stale bread. The texture was rough, the crust hard beneath his fingers, but it was all they had. He broke the bread carefully, offering a piece to Leif, who hesitated before accepting it with a tentative nod. Their eyes met in that moment, sharp, searching, both weighing the unspoken questions that hung heavily between them. In the silence that followed, the crackle of the fire became the only sound, steady and grounding. Leif's gaze drifted to the walls, where crude carvings and faded tapestries told stories of battles long past and gods long forgotten. His fingers traced the edge of a small wooden amulet that hung from his neck, the grain worn smooth by countless nights of restless travel. The carving was simple, a tree, its branches entwined like fingers reaching toward the sky. It was a symbol of life and endurance, though its meaning was known only to him. Ragnar shifted, unaccustomed to the stillness. The cabin was too small to hide from the weight of memories, and yet it was the only refuge he could offer. His eyes flicked to the narrow window, where the last light of day bled through the frosted glass, painting the room in muted grays and blues. The cold pressed at the edges of the warmth, a reminder that outside, the world remained unforgiving. "Drink," Ragnar said gruffly, breaking the silence as he passed a wooden cup filled with water to Leif. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he took it, lips dry and cracked. His throat worked as he swallowed slowly, eyes never leaving Ragnar's face. There was a flicker of something, gratitude, fear, or perhaps a mix of both, that passed between them unspoken. Leif's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "Why? Why did you save me? You could have left me for the wolves." Ragnar's gaze darkened, the shadows deepening around his eyes. He sat down heavily on a stool near the fire, the weight of his own past pressing down with renewed force. "Because I have walked through darkness before. I know what it means to be hunted, to be alone, and I remember the faces of those I lost." His voice was low, rough with the remnants of old wounds. "I could not turn away." Leif nodded slowly, relief flickering in his tired eyes. He pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders, the fabric stained and worn from travel. "I thought I was done for. My home burned, my family gone." He swallowed hard, a shadow crossing his face. The men who came, they showed no mercy. Ragnar's jaw clenched. The name Ivar echoed in his mind like a dark drumbeat. The cruel architect of his own torment, the harbinger of destruction upon so many. Yet here was Ivar's blood, fragile and broken, sitting before him in silence. "Tell me," Ragnar said softly, "what do you remember of that night?" Leif's eyes held a distant pain as he recounted the shattered pieces. They came with fire and steel, like the fury of the gods themselves. "I was out hunting when they struck. When I returned, all that was left were ashes and bodies." His voice faltered, but he pressed on. "I barely escaped. The others, they were taken or killed. My mother, my sisters, the weight of loss settled between them like a stone." Ragnar's fists clenched, the pulse of anger rising beneath his skin. Yet there was a cautious restraint in his posture, a careful balance between fury and control. The potion from Helga pulsed through his veins, a bitter shield against the chaos lurking in his mind. Helga's voice came then, soft yet firm, as the old woman entered the cabin, her presence like a whisper woven into the smoke and shadows. "They will come again," she said, her pale eyes fixed on Leif. "The blood of Ivar runs strong, but this boy is not yet lost to the darkness." Leif looked up, startled by the sudden arrival. "Who are you?" he asked, voice trembling. "I am Helga," she replied, settling beside the fire. "I tend the wounds that swords cannot reach. I see the paths that weave through fate's web." Her gaze shifted to Ragnar. "And you, Urso Vermelho, carry a burden heavier than most. But you have not yet fallen." Ragnar's voice was rough, edged with exhaustion. "The nights are long, the dreams relentless. I have killed those I swore to protect, lost to a fury I cannot always command." Helga nodded knowingly. "The poison you drank grants clarity, but only fleetingly. The beast within is patient." Her hands, marked with ancient symbols, rested briefly on Ragnar's arm, a gesture of both comfort and warning. "Find strength in purpose. That is your path." The flicker of the fire mirrored the flicker of hope in their eyes. For a moment, the cabin held a fragile peace, a sanctuary from the storm gathering beyond the trees. Leif shifted, wincing as a sharp ache crawled through his side. Ragnar's gaze softened as he reached down, fingers brushing gently against the torn fabric of the boy's tunic. There, beneath the bloodstains and grime, was a shallow wound, raw and angry. "Come," Ragnar said quietly, moving to a small wooden chest. He pulled out a linen cloth, dampened from a bucket of clean water nearby. "This will sting." Leif flinched but held still as Ragnar dabbed carefully at the wound, the coolness a sudden relief against the burning pain. The silence between them was thick, filled with the language of small kindnesses, the gentle touch, the steady breath, the shared vulnerability. Ragnar's eyes searched Leif's face, noting the faint tremor in his hands, the way his jaw tightened in quiet endurance. The boy was stronger than he seemed, carved from the same harsh soil that shaped men to survive and fight, yet also fragile in ways that demanded protection. "Rest," Ragnar urged after tending to the wound. "You need strength for what lies ahead." Leif nodded, sinking back against the wall. The firelight caught the strands of his pale hair, a halo of fragile light amid the darkness. His gaze held a mixture of weariness and something else, a spark that refused to be extinguished. As the night deepened, Ragnar sat close, the weight of his own torment a silent companion. Around them, the world beyond the cabin whispered of dangers yet to come, of enemies and betrayals, of blood debts, and the fragile hope of redemption. But here, in this moment, two souls reached across the chasm of silence and pain, bound by the unspoken promise of protection and trust. The fire flickered, the shadows danced, and for the first time in many nights, the darkness seemed a little less absolute. The cold dawn barely touched the horizon when whispers began to stir through the village of Ravenholm like a creeping fog. From the low cabins to the clustered fire pits, voices carried hesitation and suspicion, threading through the crisp air with growing urgency. News, like wildfire, spread of the stranger sheltered by Ragnar Thorvaldsson, the berserker who had once been the village's fiercest warrior, now a man caught between fury and fragile control. The earliest whispers came from the fishermen tending their nets by the shore, their hands rough and voices hushed. "I saw the boy," one murmured, his breath trailing white in the chill. "Leif Erikson, they say, son of Ivar the Cruel." Another spat into the frozen mud, his face hardening. "And Ragnar hides him. A wolf nursing a lamb." From the smoke-darkened doorways, burly men emerged, their faces carved by frost and years of labor. Mothers drew children inside when they passed, their eyes glancing furtively toward the berserker's cabin at the edge of the settlement. The bonds that once held the community together stretched thin, fraying under the weight of fear. Torstein Halvorsen, the Jarl's advisor, moved swiftly through these murmurs like a shadow drawn to light. His presence was a reminder of the power and authority that governed Ravenholm, but also of the suspicion that simmered just beneath the surface. His limp was barely noticeable now, his gaze sharp and calculating as he gathered a small group of trusted warriors near the longhouse. They say Ragnar's sheltering. The old wooden door creaked open, and Helga stepped inside, her presence as steady and familiar as the quiet breath of the forest. Her pale eyes met Ragnar's, full of unspoken warning. "They watch," she said softly. "Fear is a blade that cuts deeper than steel. Thorstein stirs the hornet's nest. Soon, the village will demand answers or blood." Ragnar clenched his jaw, the familiar tightening in his chest. "I will not let them harm him. Not again." Helga approached the fire, her fingers tracing the worn runes carved into the wooden frame of the hearth. "You carry the Berserker's blood, but you have learned to temper the beast. Others have not. You must be their shield and their sword." Her words hung heavy in the smoke-thick air. Ragnar knew the path ahead would demand more than brute strength. It would require the fragile blade of trust, forged in fire and tempered by hope. Morning thickened into day, and the tension in Ravnholm's heart beat louder. Thorstein's presence grew more frequent, his sharp gaze tracking Ragnar's movements, his words laced with veiled threats during council meetings. The village elders exchanged troubled glances, torn between fear of Ivar's bloodline and respect for the Berserker who had once been their champion. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Ragnar stood at the edge of the village, watching the darkening forest with wary eyes. The wind carried faint sounds, distant voices, the crackle of fire, the soft clatter of armor. Word had reached nearby clans and rival bands. A son of Ivar had been found, protected by a berserker who dared defy the old order. The risk was no longer contained within Ravnholm's borders. Outsiders would come, drawn by the promise of vengeance, power, or the chance to claim a fragment of Ivar's legacy. The villagers' gaze was a noose tightening around Ragnar's neck. Mothers whispered warnings to their children. Men sharpened blades beneath the moon. The fragile threads of loyalty began to fray. Inside the longhouse, a heated gathering unfolded. Thorstein's voice rose, commanding and sharp. "The boy's presence endangers us all. I propose we send a band to question him, and if deception is found, to rid ourselves of this threat." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Some looked to Ragnar, eyes filled with a mixture of fear and accusation. Ragnar stood slowly, the weight of his axe a familiar comfort in his hands. His voice was calm but resolute. "Leif is under my protection. This village will not become a slaughterhouse for fear and suspicion." Thorstein's lips curled into a sneer. "You speak as if you hold the fate of Ravnholm in your hands." His eyes narrowed. "But not all trust the berserker who has lost control." The room fell into a heavy silence, thick with unspoken threats. The old wounds of past battles, the blood spilled in contested loyalty, surfaced between them, a reminder that trust was a fragile shield, easily shattered by fear. As the meeting dissolved, Ragnar knew the danger was no longer just outside the village walls. It had taken root within, fed by whispers and shadows. To protect Leif would mean standing against those he once fought beside, against the very people who had called him Urso Vermelho. That night, Ragnar sat beside the fire, the bitter taste of Helga's potion still lingering on his tongue. The flames danced in his eyes as memories surged, faces of fallen comrades, the roar of battle, the blood oath that had marked him forever. The berserker within warred with the man who sought peace. Leif stirred beside him, eyes flickering open to meet Ragnar's steady gaze. "They don't trust me," the boy whispered, voice fragile but edged with defiance. "They see only Ivar's shadow." Ragnar reached out, placing a scarred hand on Leif's shoulder. "Then we will be the light they fear. You are not your father. You will choose your own path." Outside, the wind carried the distant howl of wolves, a reminder that the wild pressed ever closer. The village was a fragile ember on the edge of a dark forest, and the night was never truly quiet. In the days that followed, The pressure mounted. Scouts returned with news of rival clans gathering near the fjord, their banners dark against the gray sky. Word of Ragnar's protection of Ivar's son had spread like poison, drawing foes hungry for vengeance or power. Thorstein's whispers grew louder, his influence seeping into the village's heart. Some called for Leif's exile, others for Ragnar's banishment. The lines between friend and foe blurred, and the settlement teetered on the brink of fracture. Ragnar moved with purpose, balancing fragile alliances and mounting threats. He sought out Helga often, her wisdom a balm to his restless mind. Together, they prepared for the storm the coming winter and rival clans might bring. One evening, as the sky bled red with the setting sun, a group of warriors arrived at the village edge. Their armor was dark, marked with symbols unfamiliar to Ravnholm. The leader, a towering man with a jagged scar across his cheek, stepped forward, eyes cold and unyielding. "We have heard of the boy," the man said, voice like grinding stone. "Son of Ivar. We come for blood, or to forge a new alliance." Ragnar stepped forward, axe in hand, his breath steady despite the growing weight in his chest. The choice was clear: to fight, to guard the fragile hope he held, or to let the past consume them all. As the night deepened around Ravnholm, the village held its breath. The future hung in balance, fragile as the thin ice on the fjord. And in the heart of the storm, Ragnar Thorvaldsson prepared to face the reckoning. For Leif, for the village, and for the man desperate to tame the beast within. The nights would be long. The shadows would grow. But Ragnar was no longer alone, and the world was watching. The sky had settled into a heavy gray, the kind of oppressive overcast that seemed to press down on the bones of the earth itself. Ravnholm was no longer the quiet village Ragnar once knew. The air hung thick with dread, and every shadow seemed to stretch longer, as if waiting for the inevitable storm to break. The tension had become a living thing, crawling under skin, sharpening ears to every whispered secret and every cautious footstep. Ragnar stood at the edge of the village, his broad back pressed against the rough bark of an ancient pine. The cold bit at his exposed face, but the fire within him burned hotter than the winter wind. His eyes, sharp and piercing even in the dull light, scanned the horizon where dark shapes moved slowly through the mist. The approaching warbands drawn by the bloodline of Ivar and the promise of conquest. Thorstein's warnings had been relentless. The Jarl's advisor had rallied a faction of the village, the suspicious and fearful, their hands itching to strike before the enemy arrived. They whispered of betrayal, of treachery born from Ragnar's defiance, and of the danger that Leif carried like a curse. The murmurs had grown louder until they boiled over into open threats. The longhouse had filled with voices sharp as blades, and Ragnar had answered each with the calm edge of his axe's promise. But words meant little now. The siege was not only of the village's walls, but of its very soul. The sun dipped lower, casting a pallid light across the fjord and the dense forest beyond. From within the village, flickering torchlights spilled onto the frozen earth, a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. Ragnar's breath rose in thick clouds as he turned away from the tree and began the slow walk back toward the heart of Ravnholm. The eyes of the villagers followed him, some filled with hope, many with fear, and others with cold judgment. The weight of their gaze was heavier than any armor. Inside the longhouse, the murmurs erupted into an uproar. Thorstein held court like a judge passing sentence, his voice a whip cracking through the air. "This boy," he declared, gesturing toward the corner of the hall where Leif had been brought under guard, "is the son of a monster. Ivar the Cruel. His blood runs through these veins, and with it comes ruin. We cannot allow this darkness to take root here." Leif's green eyes gleamed with defiance even as the men encircled him. His slender frame, though young, held a fire that flickered stubbornly against the cold tides of suspicion. Ragnar stepped forward, his presence commanding silence. He wore the bear fur cloak, the weight of his scars and his burden wrapped tightly around him like a second skin. His voice was low and steady. Torches blazed as figures emerged from the mist, warriors clad in leather and metal, bearing the marks of Ivar's clan. Their faces were fierce and unyielding, eyes cold as ice. At their head strode a man whose presence crushed the air itself, tall, grizzled, and scarred, his gray eyes burning with a terrible hunger. Ivar the Cruel. Ragnar's breath caught, but he did not falter. The weight of his axe at his side was a promise of blood and reckoning. His gaze locked with Ivar's, a silent challenge exchanged between two men shaped by the same darkness, but driven by very different fates. Ivar's voice cut through the chaos, harsh and commanding. Ragnar, my creation, my failure. You who survived the blood ritual and lived where others died. The boy is mine by right, and you will bring him to me. Ragnar's jaw tightened. He is no one's possession. The battle for Ravenholm ignited in a frenzy of steel and cries. The village, caught between loyalty and fear, became a crucible where every man's true nature was revealed. Thorstein rallied the villagers who sided against Ragnar, their weapons raised not only against the invaders, but against the Berserker and the boy he protected. Ragnar moved with a terrifying grace, channeling the Berserker fury with a precision that surprised even himself. But this time, the poison Helga's potion had given him was a shield, not a cage. His mind was a blade, sharp and clear, guiding each strike, each parry. Leif, despite his youth and wounds, fought beside him, the weight of his lineage forgotten in the heat of survival. His movements were quick and determined, the amulet at his neck catching the firelight as he dodged and struck. The longhouse burned, flames licking the frozen sky, and the screams of battle echoed into the night. But the true confrontation was yet to come. In the heart of the chaos, Ragnar found himself face to face with Ivar. The air between them crackled with years of hatred and unspoken vengeance. The older man's scars seemed to deepen as he sneered, the cruel glint in his eyes sharpened by the lust for dominance. You escaped death once, Ivar growled, but you cannot escape me forever. Ragnar's grip tightened on his axe. You made me what I am, and I will end what you've become. They clashed, a whirlwind of brutal force and calculated fury. The world narrowed to the sound of steel meeting steel, the sting of sweat and blood mingling in the cold air. The Berserker rage surged, but Ragnar's mind remained a fortress, his blows striking not only with the strength of a beast, but with the precision of a man who had learned to master his torment. Ivar faltered, his breath ragged, his defenses breaking under the relentless assault. The final strike came swift and unyielding, the cold edge of the axe resting against his throat. Where's my son? Ivar demanded, eyes blazing even in defeat. Far from your shadow, Ragnar answered quietly. He will choose his own path, free of your cruelty. With one swift motion, Ragnar ended the reign of Ivar the Cruel. The warband, leaderless and shattered, began to retreat into the mists from which they came, their roars fading into the winter wind. The village lay in ruin, the cost of loyalty and fear etched into every broken wall and fallen comrade. As dawn brushed the sky with pale light, Ragnar found Helga and Leif emerging from the forest's edge, worn but alive. Leif looked to Ragnar, his eyes wide and uncertain. You killed him. Yes, Ragnar said, voice heavy with the weight of both victory and loss. And now you are free. What do I do now? The boy asked, his voice a fragile thread against the vast emptiness that stretched before them. Live, Ragnar replied, his gaze steady and sure. Choose who you will be, not who you were born to be. Helga stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she placed a weathered palm on Ragnar's shoulder. The potion was a gift, but it is fleeting. The nights will still come, and with them, the beast will stir. Ragnar nodded slowly, the lines of pain and resolve etched deep across his face. I know, but now, I have purpose beyond survival. I will teach him, and myself, how to find peace in the storm. Together, they turned toward the fjord, where a small boat waited beneath the pale sky. The village behind them was broken, but the horizon stretched wide and unbroken. The sea whispered promises of renewal, of paths yet untraveled. As the first light of morning caught the waves, Ragnar and Leif pushed away from the shore. The nights would remain long and haunted, but the dawn was theirs to claim. In the silence between the crashing tides and the call of distant gulls, a fragile hope took root. A hope that even in the darkest shadows, a man could choose to be more than his past. The pale light of dawn brushed gently across the scorched earth of Ravenholm, casting long, fragile shadows where charred timbers still smoldered quietly beneath a sky heavy with lingering smoke. The village, once a place of cautious hope and fragile trust, now lay broken, its walls fractured, its silence heavy with loss. Yet amid the ruin, a fragile peace began to take root, a tentative breath in the aftermath of fire and blood. Ragnar moved slowly through the remnants of his home, the weight of exhaustion dragging at his broad frame. His eyes, sharp and clear despite the sleepless night, scanned the wreckage with a somber detachment. The scent of ash and damp earth clung to the cold morning air, mingling with the faint whisper of the forest beyond, the forest that had witnessed his torment and survival. Each step felt heavy, burdened not just by the physical fatigue, but by the invisible scars that still pressed deep within. The faces of fallen comrades haunted the edges of his vision, their silent accusations mingling with the lingering howl of the wind. Yet beneath the weariness was something new, a quiet resolve, fragile but unyielding. At the edge of the village, near the twisted remains of what had once been a sturdy fence, Leif stood with Helga beside him. The boy's pale face was streaked with soot and dirt, his green eyes sharp despite the weariness that shadowed them. His cloak hung loosely from his shoulders, tattered but a symbol now of survival against overwhelming odds. When Leif spotted Ragnar, a flicker of relief crossed his features. He hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, his movement slower but steadier than before. The distance between them was small but heavy with unspoken words, fear, gratitude, doubt, and the fragile thread of trust slowly being woven anew. "You came back," Leif said softly, voice rough with tiredness but steady. "You kept your word." Ragnar's gaze softened as he met the boy's eyes. The memory of the night's fury, the clash with Ivar, the roar of battle, the weight of the axe pressed against his enemy's throat, still lingered like a distant thunderstorm. Yet here, in this quiet moment, the Berserker's rage was tempered by something rarer, understanding. "I said I would protect you," Ragnar replied, voice low, carrying the gravity of a man who had seen too much and lost even more. "And I will." Still, Leif's shoulders straightened, a flicker of pride mingling with the vulnerability. "Some in the village, they still doubt. They see Ivar's blood in me. They fear what I might become." Ragnar's jaw tightened. The bitter taste of suspicion and fear was all too familiar. Fear is a poison that spreads faster than any blade. "But it will not claim you, not while I breathe." Helga stepped forward, her pale eyes reflecting the soft morning light. "The village mourns and grieves, but they also remember. They remember what you have done, what you have survived. The blood of Ivar may flow in your veins, but it does not define you." Her words hung between them like a sacred vow, fragile yet potent. The old healer's presence carried the weight of countless winters, of wisdom hard-earned and freely given. She placed a gentle hand on Leif's shoulder, her touch steady and sure. "Ragnar has carried a burden heavier than most," Helga said quietly. "He was forged in fire and pain, yet he stands strong enough to shield others. This boy is no curse, he is a chance." Leif looked from Helga to Ragnar, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time since the violence erupted, a flicker of hope bloomed. A fragile seed planted in the bleak soil. Leif stepped forward, his voice carrying with a newfound strength. I do not deny the blood I carry, but I am not my father. I choose who I will be. The simple declaration was met with silence, heavy and profound. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for the boy but for the entire village. The weight of lineage, of past sins and unspoken histories, pressed upon them all like a storm threatening to break. Yet here, in the quiet light of morning, a fragile promise was made, that the future could be different. Ragnar watched the gathering with a wary hope. The beast within still lurked beneath the surface, a tempest waiting for the night, but now it was shackled by purpose and clarity. He had tasted control, even if fleeting, and found it sweeter than any victory born of rage alone. Helga's gaze found his across the crowd, a silent exchange of understanding passing between them. The potion's magic was temporary, a fleeting gift, but the lessons it imparted were lasting. The battle for his soul was far from over, but for now, the fire that burned within was no longer a cruel master, but a tool tempered by will. As the village slowly began to rebuild, the wounds both visible and hidden would take time to heal. Trust, once shattered, rarely mended quickly. But in this moment, there was movement toward reconciliation, a tentative step forward in the shadow of devastation. Leif's hand found Ragnar's, a gesture unspoken but deeply felt. The boy's eyes held a question, the silent plea of one seeking more than survival, one desperate for guidance in a world forged by cruelty and blood. Ragnar's grip tightened, steady and sure. You will learn to fight with your mind as well as your strength, he said quietly, to choose your battles, and to decide who you are beyond the shadows of your past. The green eyes that met his were steady now, holding the weight of promise and the spark of something new. Together, they stood at the edge of the village, the cold wind carrying away the last whispers of the night's terror. Helga's voice broke the silence once more, soft as a prayer. The nights will still come. The beast will stir within. But so long as you walk the path of purpose, the darkness will never claim you. Ragnar nodded, the lines of his scarred face softened by the rising sun. I know, and I will walk that path with him. As the day unfolded, the village began to stir with cautious hope. The wounds of battle remained raw, but the ties that bound them, the fragile cords of forgiveness and understanding, were slowly being rewoven. In the quiet moments that followed, Ragnar allowed himself a breath he had long denied. The nightmares might never fully cease, the beast within might never be fully tamed. Yet now, he carried something more precious than survival, a reason to endure. And beside him, Leif stood not as a shadow of a cruel past, but as a beacon of possibility. The long road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and doubt. But for the first time since the blood ritual, Ragnar was not alone. Together, they would face the night. Together, they would find their way. The first light of dawn stretched its pale fingers across the shattered remnants of Ravenholm, casting a gentle glow over the village that had endured so much and yet stood despite the weight of loss. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of smoke and pine, mingled with the faintest promise of thaw. The storms of winter had not yet fully descended, but the cold was biting, a reminder of the harsh seasons still to come. Yet beneath the chill, there was warmth, a fragile ember kindled by survival and the slow return of hope. Ragnar moved among the villagers with a cautious grace, his broad frame bending now and then to lift a fallen beam or steady a trembling elder. His scarred hands, once instruments of destruction in the frenzy of Berserker fury, now carried tools of rebuilding. The hammer, the saw, the patience earned through countless battles fought not with steel, but with endurance. The clan had been fractured, their trust shattered by fear and blood, but day by day, With each shared burden and quiet word, the threads of community began to weave themselves anew. Children, their faces still streaked with soot and tears, followed behind their parents, their curiosity outpacing their caution. They watched the giant man with the red beard, whose eyes still held that fierce storm beneath calm, as if he carried not only the scars of war, but the weight of a promise. Some whispered stories of the Berserker who had tamed his own rage, who had faced death and darkness and returned to shield them all. Others kept their distance, uncertain, still afraid of the wild beast that lurked within him. But even among the wary, there was a reluctant respect, an acknowledgement that something rare had been wrought from the chaos. Leif walked alongside Ragnar, his steps steadier now, his shoulders no longer bowed by grief but squared with purpose. The boy's green eyes, once haunted and uncertain, held a quiet strength. He carried the marks of the past, faint scars and memories, but they no longer defined him. Around his neck hung the wooden amulet, worn smooth and darkened by time, a symbol of life enduring through hardship. The boy's voice had grown firmer, his words laced with conviction when he spoke to the villagers or aided in the rebuilding. Slowly, the whispers of son of Ivar the Cruel softened into murmurs of Leif, the boy who survived. Helga moved between them like a silent guardian, her presence a steady heartbeat in the village's uncertain rhythm. The old woman's hands, though aged and trembling, still wove their magic, tending wounds both visible and unseen. Her eyes, milky and distant, held the wisdom of many winters, and her deep connection to the unseen world tempered the fears that lingered in the hearts of the villagers. With quiet words and ancient rites, she sealed wounds and soothed souls, reminding all that the past did not have to be their master. The longhouse, once the site of bitter accusations and shattered trust, now stood as a symbol of renewal. Its hearth burned bright, the flames dancing and crackling with life, echoing the slow rekindling of the community's spirit. The elders gathered there often, their voices softer, their counsel tinged with cautious hope. The tales told around the fire shifted, from stories of blood and vengeance to those of resilience and choice. The old ways, once rigid and unforgiving, began to bend under the weight of new understanding. Thorstein Halvorsson's absence was a hollow ache in the village's memory. His departure, whether into exile or shadowed corners beyond their sight, marked the fading of a hard line drawn in fear. His voice, once sharp and biting, was now a distant echo, a reminder of the dangers that suspicion and hatred could breed. Without him, the village found the space to breathe again, to question old prejudices, and to see beyond the blood that had so often divided them. Ragnar stood at the village's edge one evening, the cold wind tugging at his cloak and the fading light casting long shadows beneath the ancient pines. The Berserker within still stirred, a restless storm beneath the surface of calm, but now it was tempered by a purpose that reached beyond mere survival. His gaze stretched toward the horizon where land met sea, where the unknown beckoned with silent promise. Beside him, Leif watched the sky, the faint glow of stars beginning to pierce the gathering dusk. The boy's voice broke the quiet with a question, soft yet steady. Where do we go from here? Ragnar's eyes traced the path of the fading light, the endless expanse of water stretching beyond the fjord. Forward, he said simply, to a place where the past does not bind us, where we can forge new stories. Leif nodded, the weight of that choice settling upon him like a mantle he was ready to bear. Will the night still come? A faint smile touched Ragnar's lips, bitter and knowing, but real. They will. The darkness does not vanish so easily, but we have learned to walk with it, not be consumed by it. The boy's gaze hardened with resolve. Then I will learn. I will not be my father's shadow. The silence between them was filled with the quiet strength of shared understanding, a bond forged not in blood alone, but in choice and will. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint call of ravens circling overhead, their cause a reminder of the gods watching from afar. Back in the village, life moved forward. The seasons turned. In those moments, Leif's presence was a balm, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, when peace seemed impossible, there was a spark that could endure. Together, they had faced the storm and survived, not unscarred, but unbroken. Ragnar knew the road ahead would be long, winding through valleys of doubt and peaks of hope. The Berserker's curse would never truly lift, but it could be wielded as a shield, a force tempered by purpose rather than chaos. And in the eyes of the boy he had vowed to protect, he saw the future, a future unbound by the sins of fathers, shaped by the choices of sons. The winds of change whispered through Ravnholm, carrying with them the promise of new beginnings. The village, battered but unbowed, stood as a testament to resilience, a place where the past was neither forgotten nor allowed to dictate the destiny of those brave enough to rise above it. Under the watchful gaze of the gods and the silent flight of ravens, Ragnar and Leif stepped forward together, their shadows stretching long beneath the northern sky. The night would still come, dark and restless, but so too would the dawn. And in that dawn lay the hope of redemption, the birth of legends not forged in blood alone, but in the quiet strength of the human spirit. The story, like the sea before them, was vast and uncertain, but at last it was theirs to write. The first light of dawn painted the battered horizon with soft strokes of pale gold and muted rose. The air hung heavy with the scent of smoke and damp earth, remnants of the night's violence lingering like ghosts among the charred remains of Ravnholm. Yet even amid the ruin, a fragile stillness had settled, a quiet breath after the storm. Ragnar stood at the edge of the village, his broad frame silhouetted against the awakening sky. The weight of the battle pressed on his shoulders, not only in his aching muscles or the grime marring his leather tunic, but in the invisible scars etched deep within his soul. He gazed out over the fjord, where the waters mirrored the soft light, endless and calm, a stark contrast to the tempest that had torn through the village and the turmoil still raging inside him. Leif emerged from the longhouse, his steps cautious but steady. Time had carved away some of the boy's fragile hesitance, leaving behind a quiet resolve that steadied his gaze. His pale hair, once tangled and unkempt, now fell in loose strands around a face marked by loss but not defined by it. The green of his eyes held a new kind of fire, one not born of vengeance or fear, but of choice. They stood together in silence, the distance between them filled with more than words. The past was a shadow stretching long behind them, but the path ahead gleamed with possibility, uncertain yet unyielding. Ragnar's voice broke the stillness, low and steady like the tide brushing the shore. "The nights will come," he said, "and with them, the beast within. But now, I carry the purpose to face it with eyes wide open." Leif looked toward the horizon, where the sun climbed slowly, casting light into the cold corners of the world. "And I will walk beside you," he replied, "not as a shadow, but as a man who chooses his own fate." The bond forged in blood and battle was tempered now by understanding, a fragile alliance between two souls scarred but unwilling to be broken. Helga appeared beside them, her presence as quiet and certain as the ancient forest. Her pale eyes, clouded but piercing, held the weight of countless winters and the wisdom of unseen realms. She placed a weathered hand on Ragnar's shoulder, a gesture both blessing and reminder. "The poison you drank gave clarity, but it is fleeting," she said softly. "Strength comes not from fury alone, but from the will to endure. The path is long, and shadows will linger, but so will the light." Ragnar nodded, feeling the truth in her words settle like a quiet fire within his chest. "I know. The beast sleeps beneath the surface, waiting. But now, I am the master of my own soul." The village behind them stirred slowly to life. Broken walls would be rebuilt, wounds would heal, and fears would be faced. The stories told by firelight would shift, from tales of terror and bloodshed to those of survival, resilience, and hard-won peace. The old ways would change, bent by the hands of those brave enough to craft a different future. Leif's hand found Ragnar's, their fingers intertwining with a silent promise. The boy's journey was only beginning, but under Ragnar's watchful gaze, he would learn to wield not just strength, but wisdom, to carry the blood of the past without being consumed by it. Ragnar's gaze drifted upward as a raven's call pierced the morning air, a sharp, knowing cry that echoed through the ancient pines. The bird circled above, a messenger between worlds, and its flight was a reminder that the gods watched still, their eyes unseen but never absent. "There is no peace without struggle," Ragnar murmured, voice rough with years of battle and regret. "But in that struggle, we find who we truly are." Leif breathed deeply of the crisp air, the weight of his heritage no longer a chain, but a mantle to bear with strength and honor. The sea before them stretched wide and unknown, vast and unforgiving, yet full of promise. The horizon held no clear path, only the endless expanse of chance and choice. Together, they stepped toward the small boat moored at the water's edge, their silhouettes blending with the rising sun. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with hardship, but they carried with them a lesson carved deep in blood and fire, that even in the darkest night, a man could find a way to walk through shadows and emerge into dawn. And so, beneath the eternal sky of the north, their story continued, woven into the fabric of a world where rage and redemption danced an endless dance. As the waves whispered against the hull and the wind caught the sails, Ragnar and Leif looked forward, not as prisoners of their past, but as men shaped by it, ready to face whatever nightfall might bring. For in the cold silence of the northern wilderness, they understood this truth. The fiercest battle is not against the enemy outside, but the darkness within. And the greatest victory lies in refusing to be consumed by it. The night would come again, but so would the dawn. If these tales of blood, fury, and fragile peace stir something within you, if the shadows of the past and struggles for redemption call to your spirit, then join us as we walk this path together. Subscribe and stand with us, for the story is far from over, and the night holds many more secrets to be revealed. Your voice, your presence, shapes the saga yet to be told. In those silent moments between night and day, between fury and calm, remember this. True strength lies not in the fury that consumes, but in the courage to carry the flame through the darkness. And with that, our journey continues.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.